Welcome to the virtual Malvern Festival Innovation here in the studio, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Zoe Webster, who is an expert in artificial intelligence and machine learning, has worked in this area for quite a few years, and we're going to have a discussion today about where this industry is heading. So Zoe, thank you very much for joining us. And first of all, you've been working in the industry for a while. Obviously, it's suddenly become very popular. People are talking about artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, etc. Did you see this coming all those years ago?
Short answer is not in its current form at the current speed. I would say, I've been involved in AI for about 25 years, including when I was in the early days of my career in Malvern, actually, working on developing and demonstrating cutting edge AI as it was then. And having to convince people around me that this was a topic we should be looking at and investing in. So it was quite different then. I focused around kind of explainable AI, natural language processing, machine learning. Then spent some time looking at kind of AI in the round, or the impact of technology and innovation more broadly on the economy, on society, on the environment, and how to accelerate business innovation to get the most out of it. And that was, as I said, not just AI, but advanced materials and manufacturing and biosciences, etc. So things have been developing, obviously, over the years, lots of developments in several areas. Then I spent 3.5 years or so at BT, where I built and led an AI team. So we were looking across the whole organisation, looking at what was coming out from research. I was really fortunate to work very closely with the research team, who were looking ahead and looking at the cutting edge. And so very much we were aware of some of the underlying technologies in this space, some of the enablers for the kind of the current wave of AI, generative AI in particular. But I think it took us all by surprise, the speed at which everything took off and the conversation changed from November 22 when ChatGPT was released. So I think I, like many people, was surprised by the speed of it, the speed of release, the speed of take-up, and the way the whole, it's taken the public consciousness. Everyone's talking about it. Yeah. Everyone on the street is talking about it. Companies up and down, the boards are talking about it. And I think the speed with which that happened, I found surprising.
Yeah, and ChatGPT is based on language, a large language model, and we talk about it being artificial intelligence, but it seems to me that's quite a restrictive area in that it's to do with language. But is that part of the key, that you need to understand language in effect to be intelligent? What's your thought on that?
That's a good question, and quite a philosophical one. Back in the past, I've studied philosophy of mind, so I'll have to kind of dig deeper into that. I think it's part of it. AI, essentially, a lot of AI is around pattern recognition. And of course, language is formed of patterns, whether it's grammar, syntax, semantics. And so it provides a set of patterns we can use. And of course, it's language by which we capture a lot of information. Of course, there are different languages, whether we're talking about human language or natural language, whether we're talking about machine language and code, or we're talking about any other kind of pattern or language that might be out there. So, fundamentally, it comes down to identifying and be able to characterize and recognize patterns. Language is one of those patterns. I think, whether it's the heart of true intelligence, I think it's part of it, but not necessarily all of it. Learning is another part of it. So the ability to whatever patterns you're looking for, the ability to get better at doing that, the more data you have access to. So I think it's part of it. I don't think it's the totality of it. And as you say, the current wave, natural language processing, generative AI building on that, that's just one part of AI. There's much more. There are many more kind of techniques out there to look at.
So just staying with the language side of it, obviously ChatGPT is the famous one. There are others out there that are emerging and being used. But from a business point of view, because obviously you've worked with various businesses over the years, what are the advantages of using those? What could people in their business use something like this for straight away and actually get a benefit from?
Well, people are already using it to some extent for text generation in particular. So the ability to have summarized forms or transcripts of meetings, or summaries of long documents, summaries of contracts, being able to retrieve segments or words, phrases from documents that answer a particular question. So the ability, I mean, the technology and the ability that's provided by this kind of technology is really around not having to kind of formulate a question, formulate search terms that make sense to a machine.
Right.
We can ask questions that make sense to us. We can just ask whatever we want in whatever form. And that makes it much easier for people in anywhere in a business or any organisation to really make the most of it. It's not necessarily what you get back is useful or what you get back is accurate or free of error, but it makes it much easier to ask questions in a way. But of course, it depends on having the data and the information, the background, to be able to retrieve from or summarise, etc. And you need to be sure that you've got high quality data and information in the background. But companies are using this for all sorts of things. I think, and actually, as I say, things have moved quite quickly since this kind of bubble really started to expand. And already I think lessons are being learned about how best to make use of this technology. And some of the people I'm talking to are, they started out using it to generate posts for social media because it was able to put these things together quite quickly. But people are finding that it's useful, but actually what it comes out with is not particularly tailored to the tone or brand, the voice that one wants for the brand you're representing or whatever you're doing. And so actually, rather than using it to generate the posts, it's quite useful at tailoring, playing around with a post that you've written and making it speak to a particular audience or a particular kind of perspective. So, and the same with kind of documents as well. Some people are using it as useful for, you don't have a blank sheet of paper, you can generate something automatically, but actually some people are finding it's actually better for that editing process to kind of take something you have done already and reshape it, reframe it slightly, improve on it, and people are finding it useful for that. So rather than having to send it to someone else, a colleague who might be very busy, you can use this kind of technology to provide that support. Obviously, it's used in things like software development more and more. Going back to that language capability you were asking about earlier, obviously it can translate between languages. It can generate code in response to request or question. Again, whether that code it comes back with is useful, correct, elegant, documented. All these things need to be checked. But people are using it in all sorts of different ways. But I think, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
No technology is perfect. And so I think there's a lot of learning going on at the moment about what works, what is genuinely useful, what genuinely saves time, and what is helpful for an organisation going forward. But it's interesting because the ability to be able to ask questions in natural language means you don't have to be a technical whiz to use this kind of technology. It's open to anyone much more.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think the idea that it's a helper is very interesting. I mean, Microsoft call theirs Copilot, but it is a bit like having a wingman or an assistant. And if you know over time how it helps you, you can make more use of it. So that's really interesting. And I think the coding that you touched upon there, I mean, we've always thought that coders should be, well paid. They're difficult to get hold of. There's often a skills shortage with coders. And yet here we have potentially on the horizon something that can auto code. Do you see other industries, perhaps this one as well, where actually AI is a bit of a threat to what we thought was quite a safe industry or career?
I have to say, I see it as less of a threat than maybe others do. And I think part of that is so people are starting to look and learn about how this is working. And I think in some contexts, it's becoming clearer that, these machines, obviously, they can learn from vast amounts of data, and they do, and they can provide a really powerful capability built on top of that. But they do rely on that data. And in the sense of a particular task like software development or writing high quality policy documents or whatever you're doing, it does need to learn from good examples of what's done before in order to give you good outputs. So actually, I'd argue that it's not necessarily the case that it's going to do away with the need for human level people with high levels of skills in those areas. It often takes either machine to learn from really strong software developers or strong writers or creatives to actually develop something that's useful and high quality. But it also takes those kinds of people to check its output and make sure what's coming out is useful. It does pose huge questions for training and development going forward. How do we develop really strong software engineers, software developers who can check the workings of these machines and can continue to develop code that this kind of technology can learn from? The same with creativity, the same with writing, the same in all sorts of different functions and roles. So I don't think it's going to be as simple as doing some of these tasks out of a job, out of a role. And that's where we come back to it's much more about that partnership between human and machine and how that functions going forward and how we make the best of what machines offer and what people offer. And I think, fundamentally, it sounds maybe very simplistic, but if knowledge, if information is not captured in ones and zeros, if it's not digitized, the machine can't really make use of it.
Yeah.
And so there's so much, I think, in people's heads that we don't capture for whatever reason. Maybe we haven't tried to or whatever, or it's just too hard to. But, there's so much more people also have to give and to offer. So I don't, things will change undoubtedly, but I don't think that threat is quite as live or quite as, I guess, wholesale than perhaps some people fear.
Oh, that's good. That's interesting. The other thing you touched upon was the learning and the quality of the data. And there's lots of news about where the learning has gone wrong, where there are biases and so forth. Can you say a little bit about that from your experience as to how you put those guardrails in place and what is going to happen in the future?
Well, I guess, although there's the perception that AI changes so rapidly, there are some things that really don't change. It was always a truism, certainly, when I started out in the field, that around 80% of the time you spend on an AI project is getting hold of the data and getting it in a form you can use it. And it's just 20% is the building the model and testing it and getting out there. And I think that truism holds today, even in that a lot of what you need to focus on an AI project, even with this kind of technology, is thinking about the data and making sure it's in the right place, in the right form, at the right time. Who owns it? Where's it come from? What's its provenance? How can we rely on it, etc., etc. What bias is it? It's bound to have bias, somewhere. What is that bias? What's the impact of that bias? So, relatively simple things like, removing personal sensitive information from the training set so that you try to minimize the chance that what you're going to come out with may be biased. And this is true particularly if you're ever thinking about using AI in some areas like HR, recruitment, even procurement, where you're making purchasing decisions or whatever it is, where there are people at the other end of it. Can you remove as much as possible that kind of data? At the same time, can you make use of that data later to check for bias and discrimination later on? So that would be a practice that people use, is to just be very mindful of the data you're using, taking out as much as you can, but checking for that bias, because it's quite easy to, even if you stripped everything out, it's easy to learn a proxy for personal information. So an example might be, you might be basing some form of learning on, location, postcode, but actually that might have a close correlation with ethnicity or age or all sorts of things. So just being careful to, when you're testing and when you're training and you're testing, you're validating what data you're using for what reason and what the output, the impact might be. And the other thing that doesn't change, as new tools and technologies come along, is the importance of thinking about who is impacted when whatever you're doing with AI, who is possibly going to be impacted by what I'm doing. is it my customers? Is it my colleagues? Is it wider society? Is it children? Is it someone who's not contented to their day? All these things need to be really carefully considered. And then you can think about, okay, what are the potential areas for bias and discrimination? But more broadly, data quality is about more than that. It's, does this data represent what I think it represents? Yep. And that's why it's really important to have domain experts who know what the data, where it's come from, whether it's about a telecoms network or it's about a population or it's about an individual. How's that data being collected? Does it represent what you think it is? And is it something you can rely on? Are you allowed to use it for AI? Do you own it? All these kinds of questions you need to think about very carefully. And that's not changed. It's just some of the models we're now using and relying on in some areas are built on vast amounts of data, and we don't know enough about that data, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And obviously, we've talked about the large language models, but for other applications, there are other data sets that are used for the training. So to do with images or to do with self-driving or whatever. Can you say a little bit about some of the differences of those AI applications and some of the other things beyond just sort of the use of language models as to where that's heading?
Yeah, I mean, some areas that are quite interesting. I mean, you talk about self-driving cars. I mean, one area that a lot of people are talking about at the moment is agentic AI or AI agents, which is much more about autonomy. I think it's a bit of a problematic term because I think for some people, they when you talk about AI agents, they're thinking about a personal assistant-like thing that helps you book appointments and helps you kind of undertake tasks. And actually, it's far broader than that in terms of having a machine do much more autonomously without human intervention. So that goes potentially beyond language. It could use a language model as part of what it's doing to ask questions of other systems and to retrieve information on your behalf, and to communicate with you, converse with you. But actually it's about kind of a broader side of AI, which is around how can it reason about what it's got in its environment. How can it reason about you and what your wants are and what you need, and can it respond to those in a way that makes sense? So it brings in a whole range of different parts of AI, not just those language models. Some of it's about, you talked about kind of images and video. There are other parts of generative AI which are much more about kind of whether it's diffusion models or generative adversarial networks or other things that are providing capability to generate content of all different types, and that might be embedded. That's something that an agent might use if you're asking it to perform a task that might involve generating content of different forms, or it could be image analysis where it's looking at its environment and working out what's an obstacle and what isn't. Is that obstacle moving, and should I try and avoid it or just plow into it, whatever it might be. So that's an area that's really coming to the fore. Lots of people are talking about it. It's actually an area that's been studied for quite some time. It's far from new. And even I was in Malvern, there was work going on in that space as well. So that's an area people are thinking about, and that can bring together multiple parts. But I think a key area of AI that's talking about or looking at is kind of knowledge representation and being able to reason. Because an agent, if you're acting on someone's behalf, even as a person, you've got to reason about trade-offs all the time. I've got a set of goals, which is the most important goal at this moment in time. What's the best way for me, or what's the optimal way for me to address that goal? What about obstacles on the way? What if something's hampering my progress? What do I then do? How do I manage my resources, my energy? Do I need to interact with other systems? How do I do that? So it brings together huge amounts of, opportunity, but it's technically very difficult. And of course, like self-driving cars, we've got the technology to have self-driving cars, but we haven't got them. And part of that is the system of regulation and control that's required around it. And I think that's very similar for AI agents in practice. I mean, going back to your question about kind of discrimination and bias, what if my agent discriminated against yours? Yeah. What happens then? So it gets into some really big areas quite quickly, and it's not just the technology, it's about the governance, the system of regulation and control that goes around it too.
And I mean, you've started a sort of consultancy company around this, Authentic Innovation Limited. What kind of stuff can you do to help people navigating this?
So yeah, I became a freelance AI consultant back in May, really keen to help organisations on their AI journey. So I help organisations in the public, private and third sectors. Some of it's around helping them with their AI strategy, road mapping the opportunities, so understanding what might be meaningful for them at the current time and into the medium and longer term, particularly as developments are happening. I also support with AI practice, so can help with kind of team building, understanding the skills required and what that means, and policies, procedures that might be helpful, guidance that might be helpful in terms of doing AI well and doing it responsibly. And, workshopping, giving talks, explaining people, what AI is and what it isn't, examples and how they can take that forward in their organisations.
No, that's really good. Well, Zoe, thank you ever so much for joining us here in virtual Malvern, and looking forward, obviously, to see how the landscape develops with AI. But it's been a really fascinating chat. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.